All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are diving deep into something, well, kind of heavy, the history of violence.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Your deep dive today is focused on, let me see if I can get this title right, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker, of course.
Big book, big ideas.
Definitely. And it's gotten people talking because right off the bat, Pinker throws out this pretty bold claim.
He doesn't mess around, does he?
Yeah.
Gets right to it.
Right. So the claim is, well, he says that violence has actually been, get this, declining throughout human history.
Yeah, and that's not what people expect to hear, is it? You turn on the news. Seems like the world's going crazy.
Exactly. And even without the news, we kind of just assume that things were rougher in the past, like the good old days weren't so good, if you know what I mean.
Right, like that old saying, life was nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. But Pinker is saying, hold on a minute, not so fast. He's not just talking about like a recent dip in the crime rate or anything.
No. He's talking about a really long-term trend, over centuries, playing out on this huge historical scale.
Right. The long game of violence and how maybe, just maybe, we're getting better at this whole not killing each other thing.
Maybe. But to understand any of this, we've got to start by, ditching some of our preconceived notions. That myth, that idea of the noble savage?
Oh, yeah, like the romanticized view of tribal societies living in harmony with nature and each other before civilization corrupted everything.
Right, and Pinker's like, not so fast. It's like that Thomas Hobbes idea. Remember him from school? Life before civilization was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A war of all against all.
Every man for himself, basically.
Yeah, and while those pre-state societies, they weren't exactly having peace summits every other week, the evidence from archaeology and anthropology, it actually suggests something interesting.
What, that they actually had it all figured out, like some kind of prehistoric utopia.
Not exactly a utopia, more like their violence was, well, different, nuanced maybe. And to really wrap our heads around this, Pinker takes us way back to our primate cousins.
Oh, you mean like monkeys?
Well, not just any monkeys, chimpanzees, our closest relatives, genetically speaking. And they're known for something pretty intense, strategic violence.
Strategic violence? Chimps? Are we talking like full-on Planet of the Apes warfare here?
Not quite that dramatic. But it's not all banana sharing and grooming either. Imagine this, groups of chimps launching planned raids on neighboring groups. And not just in self-defense either. We're talking attacks driven by competition.
Competition? Like over what?
Territory, mainly. Resources like food, sometimes even mates.
Hold on, so they're not just reacting to threats, they're actually strategizing, thinking about the future, like how to secure their group's dominance.
Exactly. It's kind of chilling when you think about it, right?
Well,
That capacity for calculated aggression, it goes way back. It suggests those violent urges we see in humans, they have deep evolutionary roots.
okay, now that is both fascinating and slightly terrifying. But I can't help but think about, well, bonobos.
Ah, the make love, not war primate.
Units. Exactly. They're like the poster children for peace-loving primates. If chimps are our violent cousins, couldn't our ancestors have been more like the bonobos?
It's a nice thought, right? Everyone getting along, free love, the whole shebang.
Right.
And bonobos, they're definitely interesting. Their social structure's totally different. But, and this is where it gets a little tricky, the evidence we do have suggests that our early ancestors, they were probably more similar to, you guessed it, chimps.
So much for the peace-loving ancestors.
Right, at least in terms of their social organization.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, their capacity for, well, aggression. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. Back then, those traits, as brutal as they were advantageous for survival. You had to protect your group, your territory, even if it meant resorting to violence.
Right. It was a different world back then.
Absolutely.
So, okay, violence is a part of our story. We're primates, after all. What a long history of conflict. But if early humans were so prone to fighting, how did we ever start to move away from that? How does any kind of peace, or even just less violence, how does that even begin to take hold?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where things start to get really interesting. We've got to look at the rise of the first states.
So civilization as we know it.
Yeah, pretty much. Remember Hobbes and that whole Leviathan idea we were talking about earlier? He believed that you needed a strong central authority, a state that could basically monopolize force to keep our, let's say, less desirable impulses in check.
It's like, okay, everybody, put down the spears and rocks. We've got a new sheriff in town, and he's got a bigger stick than all of you.
Well, It was probably less about a benevolent desire for world peace and more about, good old-fashioned power consolidation. But the effect, at least to some extent, was a reduction in certain types of violence.
So less random smishes and blood feuds between families, more like, let's take this to the king's court.
Yeah, you could say that. Within the borders of those early states, at least. Of course, we're not talking about some kind of instant utopia here. Let's not forget the brutality that was still, pretty rampant, even as these larger states merged.
Right, early empires weren't exactly known for their gentle touch.
Exactly. Pinker's not saying that the rise of the state magically solved everything, but it marks a definite shift in the overall landscape of violence. We're moving away from constant tribal warfare towards something, well, different.
Different. Hopefully a bit less bloody.
One would hope, right.
So how does this different actually start to, play out? If things were still so rough, how did this decline, this idea that over time there's been less violence? How did that even begin?
Well, to get to that, we've got to dig a little deeper into what Pinker calls the civilizing process.
Okay, so what is that, the civilizing process? What are we talking about here?
Well, it's gradual, but it's powerful. It's this complex web of factors that start to really reshape norms and behaviors. And this is especially true in Europe, where Pinker focuses a lot of his attention.
And this is all happening over centuries, right?
Yeah, we're talking about the long game here.
Yeah.
But to give you a really concrete example, one of the most striking changes that Pinker points to is the homicide rate in Europe. He uses data from England, Scandinavia, Italy, and it's pretty remarkable what he found. Over several centuries, the murder rate just plummets.
Like, how much are we talking about here?
We're talking a drop from, well, imagine Game of Thrones levels of murder and mayhem down to, well, not quite modern day, but you start to see a real shift. It's like civilization is slowly, painfully emerging.
Wow, okay. That is a massive shift in behavior. We're talking a drop from, like, Game of Thrones levels of murder down to, well, not quite modern day, but you start to see civilization emerging. That's a massive shift in behavior. What drove that kind of change?
Well, Pinker argues, it's not just one thing, right? It's like this perfect storm of factors, all kind of converging over time.
A perfect storm, huh? So, what were some of the biggest gusts in this historical hurricane of peace?
Well, for one, as trade routes expanded and economies grew, they became more valuable alive than dead.
Makes sense. Can't make a deal with someone you just ran through with a sword.
Right. Who knew that capitalism could have a hand in, making things a little less stabby?
Right. It's like suddenly there's a financial incentive to, not murder your neighbor.
Exactly. And plus, like we were saying before, having a stronger central authority, that probably helped too, right?
Oh, yeah. The rise of kings and laws and all that definitely put a damper on those good old-fashioned blood feuds.
For sure. The Leviathan had its role to play, no doubt. But Pinker also talks about this other really interesting factor, something he calls the feminization of culture.
Feminization. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Break that down for me.
So basically, as women start to gain more influence, socially, economically, politically, you see society start to move away from this glorification of violence. And let's face it, for a long time, violence was largely
A guy's thing.
yeah, pretty much, a way for men to prove their dominance, their strength, all that. But as women's voices become more prominent, you see this shift towards valuing different traits. Things like, self-control, empathy, cooperation, all those things that don't exactly scream, I'm going to go start a brawl in the town square.
So more women at the table meant fewer duels to the death over insults?
Yeah, you could say that. It's obviously more complex than that. But you're getting the idea. It's this gradual shift in norms and values happening over generations. Violence, it's not seen as quite so glorious anymore.
Okay, this is all fascinating, but I have to, play devil's advocate for a second here. What about the 20th century? I mean, we had 2 world wars, genocide on a horrifying scale, totalitarian regimes is like the bloodiest century in human history. Doesn't all of that just completely wreck this whole decline of violence thing we've been talking about?
Absolutely. It's a completely valid question. And to Pinker's credit, he doesn't shy away from it at all. He acknowledges right up front that, yeah, the 20th century, it was a rough one. A major spike in violence, a kind of reversal of the civilizing process, as he puts it. But, and this is a big but,
Please, tell me there's a but coming.
there is. He argues, and I think pretty convincingly, that it was a temporary deviation, huge deviation, don't get me wrong, but fueled by very specific historical circumstances, not a complete refutation of this long-term trend we've been discussing.
Temporary. I mean, the death toll from those events was astronomical. How can you call that temporary?
Because, and this is key, Pinker's looking at the big picture here. He's not just looking at raw numbers. He's looking at violence as a percentage of the population over time. And when you look at it that way, even with those horrific events, and it's important that we don't minimize those, the rates are still significantly lower than they were in, say, the Middle Ages or during those tribal warfare days we talked about earlier. Plus, you've got to remember that power law distribution of violence he talks about.
Power law distribution. Refresh my memory here. What was that all about?
So basically it means that even though those 20th century conflicts were incredibly destructive, they were also relatively rare. The really big catastrophic wars, they're actually becoming less frequent, even as the world population explodes.
Okay, so fewer big wars, even if they're more devastating, actually represent a decrease in overall violence. I'm starting to see how he's putting the pieces together here. But what caused that surge in the first place? What happened in the 20th century that led to such unprecedented bloodshed?
Well, it's complicated, right? Like we were saying, it's never just one thing. But Pinker points to a couple of key factors. One of the biggest ones, and this is scary to think about, is the rise of these totalitarian ideologies. Nazism, communism, these movements, they had these utopian visions, right?
Yeah.
A perfect world, equality for all.
Sounds good on paper.
Right. But the problem was they were willing to use any means necessary to achieve those goals, including, and this is the terrifying part, incredible, almost unimaginable violence.
It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. And because these ideologies, they weren't about compromise, they weren't about working within existing systems, they demanded total obedience,
Yeah.
total conformity.
Yeah.
And anyone who disagreed, anyone who stood in the way, well, they were expendable, enemies of the state, obstacles to be eliminated.
It's chilling, really, to think about how easily people can be swept up in these dangerous ideologies.
It is. And it's a good reminder that even with all the progress we've made, things can unravel incredibly quickly. We're not immune to that kind of collective madness. Pinker, I think he recognizes that. He's cautiously optimistic about the future, but he's not naive. He knows that human nature, it hasn't magically transformed overnight.
So we're not out of the woods yet?
Not quite. We still have those, how did he put it? Ah, yes, those inner demons, those primal urges toward dominance, revenge, even sadism, all the things that can lead to violence, even in the absence of, a full-blown totalitarian regime.
Inner demons. Catchy. So, are we just doomed to repeat these cycles of violence forever? Are we just slaves to these primal urges? Is there any hope?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because Pinker argues that alongside those inner demons, we also possess better angels. Empathy, self-control, a moral sense, our capacity for reason, and that these forces, they've been shaping human history just as much as those darker impulses.
Okay, now this is what I want to hear. Give me the good stuff. What's the science behind these better angels? How do they actually work?
All right, well, let's start with self-control. You familiar with Phineas Gage?
Vaguely. Didn't he have some kind of accident? Something with a railroad spike, right?
Yeah, but it wasn't just any accident. This thing was brutal. Picture this. A metal rod, like 3 feet long, goes straight through this guy's skull.
Ouch. That's gotta hurt.
Yeah, and somehow he survives. But here's the thing. The rod, it went straight through his orbital cortex.
Is what now?
The orbital cortex. It's a part of the brain that's super important for, well, basically keeping our impulses in check.
Yeah.
Regulating our emotions, helping us make good decisions, plan for the future, that sort of thing.
So it's like the braking system for our inner demons.
Exactly. And after the accident, well, let's just say Gage, he became a whole new person. Impulsive, prone to outbursts, couldn't hold down a job. He became a walking, talking example of what happens when self-control goes offline.
Yikes. So I guess the takeaway is if we want to be less violent, we need to keep that orbital cortex in tip-top shape.
Exactly. Damage to that area, whether through injury or some other neurological issue, it's often linked to increased aggression and violence. And even for those of us lucky enough to have, all our brain bits in the right place, self-control, it's not unlimited. It's a resource that can be depleted.
Kind of like a muscle that gets tired after a workout.
Exactly. And just like a muscle, it needs time to recover. And here's the kicker. Pinker says that things like poverty, hunger, chronic stress, these things can actually chip away at our self-control, making us more likely to make well, let's just say bad decisions.
So it's not just about teaching people to control their anger, it's about addressing these larger social problems that make violence more likely in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about creating a world where those better angels have a fighting chance.
Right. Like, it's hard to be a peaceful, rational person when you're constantly struggling to survive.
Exactly. So that's self-control. What else? Ah, yes, empathy. That seems like a pretty straightforward force for good, right?
Yeah.
The more empathy we have for each other, the less likely we are to, do terrible things to each other.
Right. Seems pretty logical. So what's the catch?
The catch is empathy, as it turns out, it can be a little bit of a double-edged sword.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, for starters, empathy, it tends to be, well, biased. Like, we naturally feel more empathy for those who are similar to us, those we see as part of our in-group, our tribe.
Which would explain why those tribal conflicts we talked about earlier, why those could be so brutal. It's easier to dehumanize someone, to inflict violence, when you don't see them as really human, as part of your group.
Exactly. But it's not just about us versus them. Even within a society, empathy can sometimes lead us astray. Pinker talks about this research by this psychologist, C. Daniel Batson.
What did Batson find?
So Batson, he does all these experiments, and he finds that people, they're often more likely to help someone they feel empathy for, even if it means like screwing over someone else who might actually be more deserving.
Interesting. So empathy can work against fairness in certain situations?
It can. It's like our brains are wired to care more about the person right in front of us, the one we feel that emotional connection with, even if it means being unfair to someone else.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not that empathy is bad, it's just that it needs, what, like a guidance counselor or something?
Yeah, kind of. Pinker's not saying we should ditch empathy altogether. He's just saying it needs to be balanced by reason. We can't just rely on our gut feelings all the time.
Gotcha. So I've got self-control, empathy. What about our moral sense? How does that factor into all of this?
Well, Pinker argues that our moral sense, those gut feelings about right and wrong that we all have, those evolved for a reason, to promote cooperation within groups, to punish cheaters and freeloaders.
Basically, the rules that allow us to live together without constantly bashing each other's heads in.
Exactly. And as societies became more complex, well, so did those moral rules.
Give me an example. How has morality, quote unquote, helped us become less violent?
Think about how our attitudes towards something like torture have changed. I mean, for centuries, torture was just like a routine part of life, used for punishment, for interrogation, sometimes even entertainment, believe it or not. But over time, thanks in part to the rise of Enlightenment ideas, torture started to be seen as, well, morally abhorrent, something that civilized societies simply didn't do.
Which is amazing when you think about it, that we've managed to, like, collectively decide that some things are just beyond the pale no matter what.
It is. And that shift, it didn't happen overnight. It took centuries of activism, of people speaking out against injustice, of gradually expanding our circle of moral concern. But it's a powerful testament to the idea that our moral sense, it's not static, it can evolve.
That's encouraging. But if we're being honest, it feels like we still have a long way to go.
Oh, absolutely. And Pinker would agree with you there. He's not saying that we've achieved some kind of moral utopia. Because here's the thing, our moral sense, as amazing as it is, it can also be manipulated.
Right, like how some people try to justify violence in the name of religion or nationalism or some other greater good.
Exactly. That's why Pinker keeps coming back to the importance of reason, our ability to think critically, to question our own assumptions, to consider different perspectives.
So we need to be careful not to let our emotions, even our moral outrage, lead us astray.
Right. We need to be able to take a step back and say, okay, is this really justified? Or am I just reacting emotionally? Am I letting my tribal instincts cloud my judgment?
Deep stuff. So where does all of this leave us? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. Chimpanzees, kings, homicide rates, the tumultuous 20th century, these inner angels and demons battling it out inside our heads. Where does Pinker come down on all this? Is the world actually becoming a more peaceful place?
Well, Pinker, he's cautiously optimistic. He argues that, yes, there's a lot to be worried about, but there's also a lot to be hopeful about.
Give me some hope then. Why shouldn't I just crawl under my desk and hide from the world?
Because, for one thing, and this is a big one, we've got this thing called the long peace going for us.
The long peace. That sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm drawing a blank.
Right, so it's this period since World War II where, and get this, we haven't had a major war between great powers.
No major wars, you mean, like, at all?
Not on that global scale. Sure, there have been plenty of smaller conflicts, proxy wars, regional skirmishes. all that. But nothing like those two world wars that just ripped the planet apart in the 20th century.
Okay, when you put it that way, it is kind of amazing. Over 70 years without a global conflagration,
Yeah.
that's
Well, it's something.
it is, and it's not just the absence of those big wars either. The overall rate of war deaths as a percentage of the population, it's plummeted. Even when you factor in all the other horrible stuff like genocide, mass killings, the numbers are dramatically lower than they were in earlier eras. That is pretty mind-blowing when you really stop and think about it. So are we living in some sort of golden age of peace? Have we finally figured it out?
It's tempting to say that, right? Like maybe we've turned a corner as a species. But Pinker, he's careful not to overstate things. He's quick to point out that new threats have emerged, things that could disrupt this hard-won peace.
Okay, so what kind of threats are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, there's the whole nuclear proliferation issue, the fact that more and more countries are getting their hands on increasingly powerful weapons. That's a recipe for disaster if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, that's not great. What else?
Climate change. That's the big one. It's like this giant, slow-moving train wreck that has the potential to, well, make everything worse.
Mhm.
Resource scarcity, mass displacement, political instability.
Right, it's like climate change just throws gasoline on all the existing fires, making everything more volatile.
Exactly. It's not like climate change directly causes war, but it creates an environment where conflict is more likely.
Okay, so we've got nukes, we've got a planet on fire. It's enough to make you want to give up and go live in a bunker somewhere.
I hear you. It's a lot. But here's the thing to remember. We've faced huge challenges before, and somehow we've managed to, muddle through. And a lot of that comes down to, well, to those better angels we were talking about earlier. Pinker calls it the escalator of reason.
The escalator of reason? Sounds fancy.
Basically, it's this idea that over time, we're becoming more rational, more empathetic, more cooperative. We're getting better at solving problems together, at seeing the bigger picture, at understanding that, blowing each other up is probably not the best way to solve our problems.
It's like our brains are slowly but surely catching up with the fact that we're all stuck on this planet together.
Exactly. And Pinker believes that this escalator of reason, it might just be our best hope for navigating the challenges ahead.
So, about those looming threats, you mentioned nuclear terrorism before the break. How worried should we be about that? Is it a realistic danger or more like, something out of a Hollywood movie?
I mean, nobody knows for sure, right? Thankfully. But Pinker does lay out a pretty compelling argument for why we can't just ignore it.
Okay, so why not? Why is nuclear terrorism something we should be taking seriously?
Because even a small-scale attack, even if it didn't wipe out, all of humanity, it would still be absolutely devastating.
Devastation we can't even imagine, right?
Exactly. And not just the physical destruction, but the psychological impact, the political fallout. Imagine the fear, the distrust, the potential for things to just spiral out of control.
It would completely change the world as we know it.
Exactly. And what makes it even scarier is that the knowledge, the materials, all the stuff you'd need for that kind of attack, it's becoming more accessible, not less.
That is a chilling thought. So I guess what you're saying is we can't just bury our heads in the sand and pretend this isn't a possibility.
Exactly. We have to be honest about the risks, even if it's uncomfortable. Okay, so we've got nuclear terrorism. What about climate change? We were talking about that before the break as well. Where does that fit into all of this?
Right, because that's the other big one, right?
Yeah, Pinker, he sees climate change as this, threat multiplier.
Yeah.
It has the potential to create all these cascading problems, things that can make conflict way more likely.
Like what? Give me some specifics.
Well, for starters, you've got resource scarcity.
Yeah.
As the planet heats up, water becomes more scarce, crops fail, people are forced to migrate, compete for dwindling resources.
Yep.
It's not hard to see how that could lead to, tensions boiling over.
Right, it's like adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. Then you've got mass displacement. We're already seeing this. People forced to flee their homes because of rising sea levels, extreme weather events. And when you get massive movements of people like that, it puts a huge strain on everything. Resources, infrastructure, social cohesion.
It's like this ripple effect that just keeps spreading.
And those ripples, they can easily turn into, waves of instability, of unrest, of conflict.
So where does that leave us? It feels like we're at this, this really precarious point. On the one hand, you've got all these reasons to be hopeful, all this progress we've been talking about. But on the other hand, you've got these huge existential threats like we've never faced before.
It's a weird time, isn't it?
Sure.
We've never had it so good, objectively speaking. But it also feels like the stakes have never been higher. And you know what? You're right. We are at this crucial point in history.
So what do we do? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the first step is, well, what we're doing right now, having these conversations, learning from the past, trying to understand the forces that shape our world, both the good and the bad.
Okay, but understanding is only half the battle, right?
Yes,
What
ma'am.
about action? What can we actually do to make sure those better angels, as Pinker calls them, actually win out?
Well, it starts with choices. Every day we make choices, big and small, that either reinforce those better angels or, well, give those inner demons a little more power. We can choose to support leaders who prioritize diplomacy and cooperation. We can choose to invest in education, to address inequality, to create a world where violence is less likely to take root in the first place.
So it's about being intentional, about making choices that align with our values, with the kind of world we want to create.
Exactly. And it's not just about the big global stuff. It's about how we treat each other every single day. Do we approach conflicts with empathy and understanding? Or do we let our anger, our fear, our more, let's say, primitive instincts take over?
It's about making those better angels a habit, something we practice every day in every interaction.
Exactly. Because those small acts of kindness, of compassion, of choosing reason over reaction, those are the things that over time add up to real change.
Well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from warring chimpanzees to the rise and fall of empires, to the strange mix of hope and fear that defines our current moment. It's a lot to process, but hopefully you're walking away from this conversation with, well, maybe a little more understanding of this whole messy, complicated thing we call violence.
And maybe even a little more hope for the future.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep those better angels close. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the better angels of our nature.
See you next time.